Does this taste funny to you? By Grand Theft Motto. The first haunted house we visited was unbelievably boring. 3 small rooms, a fog machine, and 1 plastic skeleton. Lauren and Mitch were waiting outside when Melanie and I exited. People were screaming on rides all around us across the pier, but Lauren and Mitch looked half asleep. Performers in colorful costumes wandered through the crowd. The pier was part amusement park, part carnival. Melanie convinced us all to stop for a funnel cake. Perhaps that would redeem the rest of the evening. The man behind the booth was dressed like a clown, complete with a purple and yellow pinstripe jumpsuit. In fact, all of the food sellers were dressed like clowns, an entire neon rainbow of white-faced, red-nosed jesters. I suppressed a shiver. There was something surreal about clowns grinning and giggling while handing out pretzels. Then an amazing smell drifted my way on the breeze. Savory, smoky, meat. I looked for the source of the smell. 3 stalls down from the funnel cake place was a run-down booth with sausages, kebabs, and chunks of steak hanging down from the awning. Another clown was standing behind the counter. He was staring at my group, at me. I glanced up at the banner above the stall. Does this taste funny to you? There's another haunted house on this boardwalk, Trevor, Melanie said, chomping on her funnel cake. It's down by the inlet. I looked away from the clown and the meat. I don't know if I feel like another haunted house, honestly. And I've been to that one. It's not much better than the one here on the pier, Mitch said. Just a bunch of empty dark rooms with some mops hanging from the ceiling and enough junk to give you an infection if you took a deep enough breath. Lauren shook her head. I know the one you're talking about, but I think they've completely renovated it since last winter. Added a whole 2nd level, changed all the rooms. I've heard it's actually decent now. Doubt it, Mitch said. Everyone looked to me for my vote. Why not? Can't be worse than the bargain basement horror we just went through. I turned back to see if the clown at the meat stall was still watching us. The booth was now empty. We left the pier and made our way down the boardwalk to get in line for the haunted house, the Maniac Mansion. The attraction was separate from the pier, so we'd need to pay to ride. Mitch balked when he saw the price was £6 a rider, but Lauren half charmed, half shamed him into coming along. Once we paid and approached the entrance, Lauren and Mitch took the lead car, while Melanie and I got into the one behind them. The cars were all shaped like small coffins, complete with demonic faces, bats, and skulls carved into the wood. Pseudo-wood now that I looked closer. The ride operator strapped us in and waved the all clear. Remember, they aren't allowed to touch you, he said as our car began to move along the rail. What? I shouted back, but the man didn't answer. Mitch and Lauren disappeared through a swinging red door. Our car clunked along slowly. 30 seconds later, we went through that same door into pitch blackness. It was cold inside the haunted house, almost freezing. At first, the sensation was pleasant. We'd spent the last 3 hours sweating on roller coasters and merry-go-rounds, but the chill soon became uncomfortable. Melanie and I scooted closer together, and I put my arm around her shoulders. Nothing happened in the first room. No lights turned on, no sound. We rode silently through the darkness, Melanie letting out a nervous giggle as we hit a slight drop. Our coffin glided through several layers of heavy curtains, and I'll admit that I might have flinched when the fabric brushed my arm.
This is already better than those other haunted houses, and nothing's happened yet, Melanie said, shivering.
Yeah, the atmosphere is... We went through the last curtain and immediately triggered an air horn. Red lights flashed twice, revealing a room full of mannequins looming around us. Then it went quickly dark again.
"Oh my God,"
Melanie whispered.
"I'm shaking."
I swallowed, grateful that the air horn was loud enough to drown out my own scream. Yeah, freaky. The next few rooms at least had some light. Animatronic skeletons and corpses leapt out at us from the shadows. We traveled through a tunnel of spinning neon paint that ended in a sharp drop. Hidden fans blew cold air and water on us as we rolled through a room filled with fog. Just as we were about to exit the fog, I felt a strange sensation. The hairs stood up on the back of my neck. I turned around and saw a shadow approaching us through the mist. A man in a hockey mask. He walked quickly, and my brain froze. My first thought was that he was another rider who had left his car for some reason to explore this haunted house. But the man came close, noticed me watching, and then slipped around to Melanie's side. She didn't realize he was there until he was parallel to the car. When she did see him, she shrieked. The man never said a word. He followed us a few steps, then opened a hidden door in the wall and went inside.
"What the hell? What the hell?"
Melanie gasped. My heart was trying to burst out of my ribcage, but I remembered what the ride operator said before we started.
"Remember, they aren't allowed to touch you."
Live actors, I said, laughing a little. They must have added them when they did the renovations. Melanie was curled into a ball pressed into my side.
"Warn me if you see any others creeping up on us, okay?" she asked.
The actors were good. Good. A woman in a white dress caught us by surprise as we rounded a turn. A man caused both of us to jump when he revved up a chainsaw. An actual chainsaw. I thought he was animatronic too, until we got close. We just started getting used to the idea that any of the displays could come to life when our coffin entered a brightly lit room. It was completely white, blindingly so, with only 2 figures and a chair. The first was a man dressed like a werewolf. He lay face down in a puddle of blood, his leg twitching. One of his feet was severed at the ankle. A clown was seated in the wood chair nearby, chewing on that foot. Unlike the other actors, the clown's costume was ragged, dirty, and held together with patches. He wore a curly pink wig and a mask that showed white cheeks, blue eyes, and a scarlet nose. The mask left his mouth open. His teeth were crooked and stained red. It was the same clown from the meat stall out on the pier. The clown didn't move from his chair as we rolled by in our coffin. He lifted only one hand and waved.
"That's the worst yet,"
Melanie said, looking away. I turned toward her. "That body on the ground looked awfully real for a prop," I whispered.
"Stop trying to scare me,"
she said, punching my arm. I looked back over my shoulder and choked down a yelp when I saw the clown. He was standing now, staring at us. The clown began to walk, then run, then sprint toward us. We exited through a sliding door before he caught up at the last moment, and his fingers brushed my shoulders.
"This ride needs to be over, now,"
Melanie said. We were in another pitch-black tunnel, moving slowly. I thought I heard a thud of running footsteps coming from somewhere on my left. They passed us and kept going. A few seconds of silence, and then we heard the screams. It was a haunted house. We heard various yelps and curses and shouts from other riders in different parts of the building, but nothing like this. Nothing as loud. Nothing as panicked.
I want off,
Melanie whispered, squeezing my arm in a vice grip.
It's all fake,
I promised, and we're almost... Our coffin car came to a halt with a crash that threw us forward against our seatbelts.
Are you okay?
I asked.
Yeah. Christ, it's so dark. What did we hit?
Another car, I think. Maybe there was a malfunction with the track. Hold on, we need some light. I started patting my pockets, trying to remember where I'd put my cell phone. Something gurgled. I froze. The sound continued, a wet, sucking noise like someone slurping.
Hello? Is someone there?
Melanie said. I finally found my cell phone and snapped on the flashlight app. The light was emitted, a little circle that I could point around the room, but it was enough to confirm that we had hit another car that was stalled on track. I swept the beam across the back of the coffin, and Melanie screamed. Lauren was staring back at us. Her throat was slit so deep that her head was only hanging on by her spine and a few inches of skin and muscle. She was the source of the gurgling noise. Her eyes were unfocused, but she seemed to be looking directly at us. My hand was shaking so badly that the flashlight beam jumped and fell like a wasp caught in a mason jar. I shined it away from Lauren and swept it back and forth in the room. I stopped when I found Mitch. Mitch was on the ground in the tunnel. A hunting knife with a black handle was buried in his neck to the hilt. The clown from the previous room was hunched over my friend's body. When my flashlight hit him, the man looked back at us. I heard Melanie throw up, but I didn't take my eyes off that clown. He was holding Mitch's severed arm, the hand covered in bite marks. The clown chewed whatever he had in his mouth and swallowed. Then he lifted the arm in my direction and gestured for me to take it.
Does this taste funny to you?
He asked. I grabbed Mel's hand and pulled her from the cart. We ran down the black tunnel. She was screaming, or maybe it was me. It was a panic sprint until we hit the warm air and lights of the boardwalk. Then we kept running until we were on the beach. That's when Mel finally made a stop so she could call 911. By the time the cops got to the haunted house, there was no sign of anything, not even the bodies. It's been weeks, and I still can't sleep. Whenever I nod off, I have the same dream. A dark room, a smell like old pennies, a wet floor, then a voice from the blackness.
Does this taste funny to you?
My haunted house.
I had what many people would call a warped childhood. Many children are raised on nursery rhymes, fairy tales, and Dr. Seuss. And while my childhood did have these memories, my mother included another genre in mine and my sister's upbringing: horror. I cannot count the number of times when my sister and I were reading some Stephen King short story for bedtime rather than a more common children's story. Popsy was always my favorite. I grew up watching the classic horror movies and being told ghost stories. Many people, when I tell this to them, ask me if I have a lot of nightmares as a child. But the truth is quite the opposite. I was not afraid of the bogeyman or ghosts. To me, ghosts and goblins were simply fictional characters that are only in books, movies, and in stories told around the campfire. The horror genre was simply a part of my life. I loved the feeling of being scared, so naturally, Halloween was one of my favorite times of year. I remember one Halloween many years ago. I was young, but not so young that I don't have first-hand memories of the events soon to follow. There was a Halloween attraction that was running just down the street from our house. It had been going on every Halloween for a few years, but my parents had never let my sister and me go before. And then one year, we were finally given permission to go to this haunted attraction. The attraction was built into an old and abandoned manor house, just the sort of place where you would expect a Halloween attraction to be built. I remember being very excited as I waited to get inside the house, because lots of people that were coming out were raving about how scary it was, and I was highly anticipating having my own time inside. Like most Halloween attractions, they let the people inside the house only in small groups. Because my sister and I were the only children, the attendants at the door made sure we were put in the same group as our parents. Finally, we stepped inside. Inside, it could have been any haunted house from America in the 90s, full of fake fog and grease-painted actors. I wasn't overly scared, because my mother always reminded me that the actors were not allowed to touch you. But I jumped and screamed along with everyone else when a monster jumped out of a hidden nook or cranny of the old manor house. Eventually, we made our way down to the basement, which had been changed into the stereotypical mad doctor setting common in a lot of haunted houses. Needless to say, there was a lot of fake blood everywhere, but I'll never forget that basement because something just seemed a little out of place. Sometimes even the most normal things can become diabolical if you alter the perspective. It's something you see in modern ghost hunting shows and B-shots. There was something that jumped out immediately as being evil. There was certainly nothing like The Exorcist happening to tip me off that something was wrong. It was a simple sight, but that made it much more unnerving because it stood out against the overt horror backdrop of the decorated room. In the midst of the bloody carnage of the mad doctor's operating room, I remember that an old woman was sitting in the far corner. She looked to be in her 80s, had thinning gray hair, and was very thin. I would be lying to myself if I said she didn't scare me more than the rest of the attraction combined. At the time, I didn't have much understanding of the effects the different physical ailments can have on a person, but looking back now, I would have to say that she was the victim of a bad stroke. Sometimes a bad stroke will leave a person with one side of his or her face paralyzed, and that's exactly what happened to her. One side of her face was drooping, and saliva was leaking from the corner of her drooped mouth. She was talking, yelling at us as we passed by. Her words were badly slurred because of her paralyzed face, but I could make out what she was yelling. Stop, get out, over and over again. Even passing through the basement and going out the other side, I could still hear her screaming in that awful slurred way up the stairs. I was extremely disturbed by the sight of that old woman, but as I got away from her, I began to feel better. She was obviously an actor who was working for the attraction. Most of the attraction worked on jump scares, and she was obviously there to cater to more of the psychological horror. Well, in any case, it worked. It certainly worked on me. We emerged out into the night once again, and got that instant sense of relief that makes horror so addicting, the "we have survived" moment. My sister instantly began to talk about which part was her favorite. An actor who jumped out at her in a werewolf costume had been her favorite. When it came to my turn to share, I could think of nothing besides the old woman I had seen, and told my family about how the old woman in the basement had scared me the most. "What woman in the basement, Ashley?" my mother asked. Shocked, I began to describe as well as I could what I had seen. When I finished, my mother said that she hadn't seen any woman fitting that description down in the basement. The rest of my family agreed with her. I put the incident out of my mind. Like I said, I didn't believe in ghosts and didn't believe that they were real. I tried to rationalize why they had missed the old woman and her screams. Each attempt to do this was more pathetic than the last, but I knew that ghosts couldn't be real. The next year, I was eager to step foot in the old manor again, but I was horrified to discover that the haunted attraction had been shut down and would not be opening again. Since I lived so close to the haunt, a few people in my neighborhood had taken up jobs there, and I asked around with them about why it had closed. The few people that would talk told me that the old manor house was really haunted with real ghosts, and that too many people were refusing to work there again because of the paranormal activity going on in there. Their stories ranged from objects moving on their own to apparitions and even to physical attacks against the living that entered certain parts of the house. I laughed it off. People were letting the atmosphere of the Halloween haunt mess with them. It was probably just a couple of pranksters messing with the workers. But no matter how much I tried to explain to the workers about how it could be a couple of jokers messing around, they kept insisting that it was impossible for it to have been any human activity. But even as I tried to convince them, I couldn't help but remember the old woman that I had seen in the basement that no one else had seen. I was kind of nervous about the whole thing, and I wanted more information about the house. These days, you can look up anything on the internet and have an answer in seconds, but the 90s was not like that. Few people had internet at the time, and my family was one that did not have internet access, so I went to the next best thing, my mother. I asked her about the old manor house. At first, she was reluctant to tell me, which unnerved me more than anything, because she had never shied away from telling us things of that nature before. Finally, she told me what she knew. The manor started out as a private residence built in 1922, but the original owner lost the house in a foreclosure. After that, it became a sanitarium. Just by virtue of being a hospital in the area where it was the only hospital around at the time, a lot of people passed away within the walls. In fact, there are some reports that say that there was even at least one death a day within those walls during this time. But that was not even the part that my mother was reluctant to tell me. She told me that afterward, it was turned into a nursing facility, and they would have taken care of sick or older people just like the old woman I had seen during my walkthrough. But the records of abuse that came out of that place were numerous. My ex-employee confessed that they quit soon after being hired because of the vast amount of malpractice that happened there. My mother remembered all of this because it was in the newspapers when it was going on, and it was a huge deal in the community. It made me feel a little sick to think about how those people, those human beings, were treated in that horrible place. And that's not all. Local legend has long said that the building was haunted by the tortured souls of the people who died under the horrible conditions there. The man who built the Halloween attraction there knew of the history and the legends surrounding the place, and built the attraction with the sole purpose of playing off those stories. It was then that I knew I had seen the ghost of a woman who had died in that building. She just wanted to spend her afterlife in peace, but instead, every year she and her fellow ghosts were interrupted by the living storming through their place in the thousands, turning their situation into a joke. And for the first time ever, I began to treat ghosts and spirits not as fictional creatures only meant to frighten and scare, but as a real physical manifestation of a force that humans are not capable of understanding yet. The house to this day continues to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. The owner lets in a few local paranormal groups at least once a week,
every Friday night in fact, to do an investigation. Several ghost-themed television shows have filmed at that location. One show brought in a psychic medium who claimed that the years the house spent as a Halloween attraction have forever scarred the house and the spirits who reside there. One thing is for sure. I am now a lot more careful about checking out the history of any Halloween haunt I go to. Ghosts are everywhere, of course, but I'll never go to a place with such a sad history attached to it, and I haven't been able to get scared inside a Halloween attraction since. I don't scream, jump, or run away as the actors jump out at me. Nearly all of my friends have commented on my bravery in the face of these Halloween attractions. But I'm not brave. Not really. It's just lack of fear, because it's hard to get scared by actors in makeup when you've been inside the real thing.